Good evening, friends. Today we have a fifth day of our India's webinar series. Let's welcome our speaker, renowned speaker, C.A. Shweta Milani Doshi. We have many new members today, new participants. So let me introduce speakers once again today on the fifth day. She is a BCom graduate from the University of Pune. She is a chartered accountant, rank holder in CA Inter. She is a completed diploma in International Financial Reporting Standard by ACCA UK. She has a certificate course on forensic accounting and fraud detection from our ICAI. She has an articleship training from GD Apte & Company, a leading CA firm. Senior consultant at Finpo Consulting. Main areas is India specialization in that, around 4 years of experience. Presently, she is a partner in Doshi RC & Company, heading the internal audit, valuation and India's division of the firm. She has a vast training experience also. She is a speaker at various forums, including our ICAI big branches like Pune and Pimpri Chinchwad. She is also conducting corporate trainings at various listed and unlisted corporates. She has a huge India's experience post qualification around 4 years in IFRS, India's US GAAP, and so on. List is, going on and on. And she is pursuing many other courses as of now also. So with this brief introduction, would like to give a charge of session to her. And before we begin the session, would like to tell you that we are coming up with GST referencer series. You must have received our message of that 5 days referencer series. So in that, would like to tell you that tomorrow we have a India series of session 6, and I think last session, and we are timing for the same is 4 to 6. So it should not clash with our GST course. So many participants requested that we want to attend GST 5 days course also, refresher course. So we have changed this timing as a 4 to 6, so it will not clash. So members are requested that seats are limited there also. Kindly participate at the earliest. With this, I am now giving charge to her. Shweta, please continue.
Yeah, thank you, Virat. Thank you for the introduction given. Good evening, everyone. I am Shweta Milani. We have been conducting this IND-AS webinars from past 4 days, and today is the 5th day of the webinars. We have covered various standards, and almost the majority of the standards which are having heavy impact for the purpose of convergence from Indian GAAP to IND-AS we have covered. So on day 1, we covered proper introduction to IND-AS, to whom it is applicable, what kind of companies get covered under IND-AS. We also covered the asset-related standards on day 1. On day 2, we covered government grants, related parties, operating segments. Thereafter, we also covered leases, and along with that, we also covered consolidation related standard, business combination. Then after that, we covered financial instruments also. So in this manner, we covered various standards under IND-AS. Today, the agenda for today's day is to cover IND-AS 115, that is revenue from contracts with customers, and to cover IND-AS 110, that is consolidated financial statements. Yesterday, we already covered IND-AS 103, which is business combination. So IND-AS 110 is a step ahead, or which requires a background of IND-AS 103, which you have already covered yesterday. For the new participants who are new in today's session, in spite of that, I'll give you a brief background about what we have covered yesterday, which has the relevance in IND-AS 110. So don't worry, the new participants, you will still have a track about what we have discussed yesterday already. So beginning with IND-AS 115, revenue from contracts with customers. Previously, under IND-AS, you had 2 different standards under revenue, similar to what we had under accounting standards. So in accounting standards, you had AS 7 and AS 9 for the purpose of revenue recognition. Under IND-AS also, you have IND-AS 11 and IND-AS 18, which was bought from IAS 11 and IAS 18 revenue recognition standards under IFRS. Thereafter, similar to whatever we have discussed previously, there was a joint arrangement between the US entities, I mean the US GAAP and the IFRS, to come out with a new standard. What was the requirement to come out with a new standard was the previous standards did not give such an elaborate model which would cover all types of revenue recognition. So there were various types of revenue recognitions or various business models which were getting not covered under the standards. There was no guidance about how to apply or what kind of revenue recognition norms to apply to such kind of transactions. So that is why they came up with a new standard, which is a complete model given for the purpose of revenue recognition. In India, this standard was first time applied on 31st March 2019. So 2018-19 is the first year of financial statements in which you would get a difference between or transition between Indian GAAP to Ind AS. Please remember, every time why do I specify that in which year it was applicable to India? Because that year's financial statement would give you an idea that what was the transition or what kind of gap differences were applied by the companies. So if you want to get an idea or you want to get a grip over the standard, you can go and download the financial statements of listed companies of 18-19. See how did they transit from Indian GAAP to Ind AS. See what were the differences, or see how did they transit from the previous Ind AS to the new Ind AS. What were the differentiating points? How much was the impact? Which accounting difference has the majority impact? How did it change the financial statements of the company? So that is why in every standard I tell you when it was first time applicable in India, so that you get an idea about how to or what are the kind of differences which the real life companies, the listed companies have been applied this Ind AS. So moving ahead to cover the standard and to provide you the what is covered under the standard, what is the 5-step model, what are the special considerations given under the standard, how to transit from your Indian GAAP to Ind AS, or how to transit from the previous Ind AS 11 and 18 to this new Ind AS 115. So beginning with the new revenue recognition model. What was the lacuna of the previous standard was it didn't give a model for the purpose of revenue recognition. It just listed conditions based on which you have to recognize the revenue. And it was majorly based on risks and rewards was the logic behind the previous standards. The fundamental difference in this new standard is it has a control model. Who controls the goods or services, and when does the customer obtain the control over this goods and services? That is the main basic fundamental logic over this new standard. So to give you an overview about what is a 5-step model, I will cover each and every terminology used in this 5-step model. But to just give you an overview about this, in step 1, we identify the contract with the customer. What is a contract? Which types of agreements will be regarded as a contract under this? How to, if there are multiple contracts, in that case, what to do? So these are the various parameters covered under this first step, that is identify the contract with the customer. Second is identify the performance obligations in the contract. This is a new terminology used in this revenue recognition standard, performance obligations, and everything is governed by this main terminology is the performance obligations. The third is determine the transaction price. Allocate the transaction price upon the performance obligations is the 4th step, and the 5th is recognition of revenue. So as you would see, if you make a mistake or if you don't understand the term of performance obligations, your step 3, step 4 and step 5, everything will give you an incorrect decision, and accordingly your revenue recognition might go to a toss. So let's begin with the first step, that is identify the contract with the customer. So in a normal circumstances, if you have any agreement between 2 or more parties that creates enforceable rights and obligations, it's a contract. That is a normal plain vanilla definition what the standard has provided. But what you have to look into? You have to look into, does the contract has a commercial substance? Has the contract provided all the pricing related terms? What kind of consideration is transferred from one entity to another? What kind of goods and services are transferred? What are the obligations or what are the commitments given by each and every parties? If all these 3-4 parameters are given, only then you can say that it is a legally enforceable contract. If it is not given, then the contract itself is lacking the commercial substance, and the question arises whether that contract itself is legally enforceable or not. The contract might be written or oral, that is a different thing, or it might be based on a customary business practice also. But thing is, clearly you should be able to identify what are the commitments or obligations that both the parties are entering into. Now, this is a bit simple, but the thing is, what are the cases in which you combine certain contracts? Do you have to combine certain contracts, and why should you do that? For example, today I am an entity. In the first contract, I'm agreeing into to provide certain designs to the customer. I'm into a turnkey project. I've entered contract number 1 to provide designs and the base map of the project. Second contract I enter into to provide the equipments that will be required in the turnkey project. Third contract I enter into by providing the installation services for that equipments. So in that contract, I'll assemble and install the goods and services. And fourth contract I enter into to provide training about how to use this particular plant. Now tell me, commercially, is the customer expecting 4 different outputs out of you? This contract is just for the purpose of legally, just a legal 4 different documents are created. But if you go by a commercial substance of the contract, the customer is intending to receive a turnkey project plan from you. You might create 4 different contracts for it. For any purposes, you might create single contract or 2 contracts, whatever. It is your legal thing what you want to enter into. The standard doesn't go over the legal form of the contract, but also requires what is the substance of the entire arrangement. If the substance of the entire arrangement it is as good as negotiated as a single package, all the negotiations were carried as a single package, will the client tell you for design this will conduct separate negotiation, for training separate, for this thing separate? It is always negotiated as a single package. You, the customer, has not come up to you for receiving 4 different services. The customer has come up to you for receiving one single turnkey project plan, and it is negotiated as a single package. In that cases, all these 4 contracts are to be evaluated as a single contract. So you will read how to recognize this revenue for all these contracts, 4 contracts put together. Just the legal form of giving 4 different contracts doesn't change your revenue recognition methodology and won't impact the way in which it should be recognized. So you purely have to combine all these 4 contracts and read it as a whole, and then you have to derive that what is the exact purpose of the contract and what is the contract saying. So this is just about how you will come out, how you will read what basis a contract is providing. So conditions for the same are: is the contract negotiated as a single commercial package? Yes. Contract or consideration in one contract depends upon the other contract. Goods and services are a single performance obligation. So what is the performance obligation? That we will discuss later on. But at least you have to read all these 3-4 contracts in context with each other. Moving ahead to the next step, that is identify the performance obligation. And this is the most important step. I want you all to be attentive and listen to each and every example that I'm giving right now. Why is, firstly, to create a background is, your revenue recognition would depend upon how many performance obligations you have decided. If you have decided 2 performance obligations in a single contract, your revenue recognition will differ. If you have decided 3 performance obligations, your revenue recognition will differ. And if you have decided it is just a single performance obligation, your revenue recognition will differ. So your amount or your measurement or the amount by which your revenue from operations shall be impacted purely depends upon this identifying the performance obligations. What are the conditions given under this standard? For the purpose of identification of performance obligations, the 2 main conditions are: is the performance obligation distinct? That is the first. Is it capable of being distinct? And the second condition is it distinct within the context of the contract? You won't understand by reading these plain languages at all. I will give you what are the further steps. So, if the first condition, let's understand the first condition. What are distinct performance obligations? So, if the service or the goods provided in the contract, if the customer can benefit out of that either individually or by some other services available in the contract or available in the market, in that cases that particular obligation is a distinct obligation. Let's see an example, then let's come back to this technical terminologies. For example, today I'm having a specialized machinery. So I am having a specialized machinery which only my company can develop it. I know each and every parameters of that machinery. It is purely my business model. It is purely my intangible asset about that machinery, how it runs and everything. And along with that, I give you an installation service. Okay. Now, since I know the machinery in and out, it is a specialized machinery of my business and it is not normal any standard of the rack machinery. Installation can only be carried by me. So there are two goods and services identified in this contract. First is the machinery and the second is the installation service. Now we need to identify whether these two parts of the contract are they distinct from each other or they are combined as one goods and services. So you will identify whether you have two performance obligations, that is supplying of goods or your supplying of your specialized machinery is one performance obligation, and the second performance obligation is providing the installation services of that specialized machinery. So whether there are two or one performance obligation, we need to identify for the purpose of revenue recognition. So let's see what are the conditions given under the contract, under the standard. The first condition is whether these goods and services are capable of being distinct. And how will you identify they're capable of being distinct? Whether the person, the customer, can benefit out of that machinery without receiving the installation services? No. Unless you install the machinery, how will you benefit out of that? So that is why the machinery is not capable of being used or not capable of being benefited without the installation service. Individually, is installation service relevant if there is no machinery itself? Obviously no. What will you install? So since the nature of the machinery is so much specialized in nature, these two parts are not distinct in nature and each part is dependent upon each other. And the second criteria is there any third party in the market who can give you this installation services? Now, since the machinery is specialized to me and my business, there is no third party who will come up and install my specialized machinery. And even if it comes, it won't be commercially viable. The customer won't be reliable that whether that installation services that have been provided are appropriate or not. So that is why these two services are not capable of being distinct from each other because of the specialized nature of this machinery, and there is no third party who will provide the installation services. So your first criteria is being met, that there is no distinct performance obligation as per the first criteria. There is only single performance obligation. Now let's see the second criteria. In second criteria, it is given what is the context of the contract. What does it mean? How is customer looking up to you? Is customer looking up to you as a single turnkey project, or is he expecting different machinery separately and installation services separately? So if the customer is expecting the output as a single turnkey project, in that cases, your second criteria is also getting fulfilled. And as per second criteria also, there is only single performance obligation. So here you have to purely look into what is the customer expecting and what is the contract saying. So if the contract is saying the customer has entered into a turnkey project with the company, then purely it shows that the customer is also expecting a turnkey project, and in that cases there is only a single performance obligation. So even if you might divide the entire contract into supply of goods and installation services, in spite of that, there is only a single performance obligation in the contract, which is providing a turnkey plant. This is the thing of performance obligations. We'll take various examples. The second example, you are building up a house, correct? In that cases, you might identify various services. First is the construction service, then is providing fittings, then is installing the windows, then is getting the bricks and making of the walls. There are so many different services which could be identified in case of construction of a house. Now tell me, in these cases, are all these services identified? If suppose today I'm DLF, if whatever services I'm providing, are they single performance obligation, or each service or providing of goods identified, is it a separate performance obligation? What is the case? Now, tell me, whenever a person is expecting a house as an output, is a customer ever expecting bricks to be got up separately, windows to be got up separately, fittings to be got up separately, and then somebody would install it, somebody else would paint it? No, customer is expecting out of you a single constructed house. So in that cases, your first condition is, let's go condition by condition. The first condition is whether the items are capable of being distinct. Now, in that cases, if today somebody is providing the fittings, you will get someone else in market who can install the fittings. You will get someone else in market who can paint your house. You will get someone else in market who will install the windows to your house. But the second condition, you as a customer, are you expecting a single integrated service or not? If you are expecting a single integrated service out of the contract, then the entity is providing your service of integrating all these services of the construction, fittings, windows, bricks, everything put together and giving you a ready house. So in that cases, none of the obligation is a separate performance obligation and everything is a single performance obligation. So this is, are you providing a integration service which the entity is expecting is a condition over here. Now, where will be the cases where these are two separate performance obligations? Let's understand that. Now, for example, you have a machinery, which is a standardized machinery. You can consider a photocopy machine, or you can consider some other huge machinery, which is a very standardized machinery. Even the installation for the same is standardized in nature. Anybody can give you the installation services. You need not even require that party to provide an installation services. So installation services is capable of being given by the third party. All right. And the third party might give you installation service in the same contract, or might even not give you the installation service in the same contract. Now, the first criteria, whether the goods and services are capable of being distinct. The goods and services are capable of being distinct because it is a very standard installation. It is not dependent. It is not a specialized machinery. So as per the first condition, you have two distinct performance obligations. That is, providing the machinery is one performance obligation, and giving the standardized installation services is a second performance obligation. Now over here, there is no integration service that the entity is providing. In that cases, entity, many times the previously also the company has entered in the contract where somebody else has given the machine and someone else has given the installation service. It might be commercially viable for the entity. In that cases, the entity is not expecting an integrated service, and that is why in these cases there are two separate performance obligations, because there is no significant integrated service provided in this case. So you will, there are machinery providing the machinery is a separate performance obligation, and giving the standardized installation service is a separate performance obligation. In this cases, both the things are separate, and accordingly the revenue recognition will differ. Now, further more practical examples will take. Can you see, everybody can see my Excel sheet? So for example, if there is a hotel, now you have ITC group of hotels. What happens in this ITC group of hotels is, you have a hotel, you book a room night in that hotel. Since you are a ITC member, ITC loyal customer, you also get certain loyalty points. Since you are getting loyalty points, what will happen on account of this loyalty points is, at the time of next visit to the hotel, at that point in time, you can redeem these loyalty points and get second room night at a considerably lower rate, whatever might be the value of that loyalty points. So in that cases, there are two performance obligations in this contract. First is giving the first room night by the hotel to use as my first obligation. But since I've credited certain loyalty points in your account, Tell me, whenever you will come next time, you're going to utilize that loyalty points. In that cases, I have to give you, just take a proper example. Today, once you stay a room night in a ITC hotel, next room night will get free of cost, if that is a scheme which is going on in the ITC hotel. In that cases, tell me, I have come first time to you, I paid 10,000 for first room night. Now, second time when I'll come free of cost, in spite of that, I am obligated to give you all the services that whatever are required in the hotel. I cannot say since your room night is free room night, you won't get electricity in the room. This is not possible. Everything what is required in a particular hotel, I have to give every kind of service. So in this case, I have two performance obligations. I have two obligations. The first one is the first room night which is given today, and the second obligation is which would be given next time when the customer would visit. So there are two distinct performance obligations in this contract. Now please understand why it is and what will get impacted. I will discuss later on when you will decide how to recognize the revenue. But please understand there are two different performance obligations and your revenue recognition will impact on account of this. We'll discuss in the further steps why it will get impacted and we'll come back to these examples. So moving ahead is determining the transaction price. Now, how would you determine the transaction price? The plain vanilla example for this is whatever is mentioned in the contract is your transaction price, which is a fixed amount. So if the contract says that 10 lakh is your contract value, then your transaction price is purely 10 lakh, nothing else. This is the plain vanilla which will come in each and every contract. Now, what to add and what to deduct from this transaction price? There are certain 2-3 concepts. The first concept is variable consideration. Second is consideration payable to the customer. Third is significant financing component, and the fourth is non-cash consideration. Everything we'll decide or discuss one by one. So first is variable consideration, and this is the most important concept. There are huge differences or huge gap adjustments which have arose on account of this concept. What does variable consideration mean? Now, in various contracts, you have the terms for discounts, you have the terms for incentives, you have performance bonuses, you have early completion bonuses, you have liquidated damages. There are various clauses in the contracts on account of which your revenue or your actual receipt might get impacted during the tenure of the contract. For example, you might have heard of a company called as Dilip Buildcon Limited. They are into the construction of bridges and infrastructures and roads. Now, any contract or any such infrastructure construction contract has certain time limit within which you have to complete that project. Now, there is a clause mentioned in the contract that in case you do not satisfy the tenure mentioned in the contract, in case you do not complete the road within a period of 24 months, then for every additional day, liquidated damages will be levied to the company at the rate of 10,000 per day. This is a clause mentioned in the contract. And the second clause is, in case you complete the project early, before the period of 24 months, in that cases, you will get a performance bonus or you will get an early completion bonus amounting to rupees 12,000 per day. This is a clause mentioned in the contract. Now, under Indian GAAP, what we used to do is, whatever is the contract value, suppose the contract value is 1 crore rupees, whatever is the contract value, that used to recognize on a percentage of completion basis. As and when you receive the bonuses or as and when the liquidated damages are charged to you, they were debited to the profit and loss account in that year. Okay, this was what used to happen under Indian GAAP. But what does the standard say is, on day one itself, you have to estimate what is the variable consideration that can impact the value of the contract. So what you have to do in such cases? On day one itself, I will estimate based on my past trend, what is the probability, how do I complete the contracts? Now the company which I gave in my example, the Dilip Buildcon Limited, the company has a past trend of every time completing the contract early. So they have a historical, every contract they complete minimum 1 month early than the normal tenure. So since you have a historical trend of completing the contract early, on day one itself, I will factor in how much is the early completion bonus that will be received to me. If I complete 30 days early the project, 30 days into 12,000, I will receive 3,60,000 rupees of bonus for one particular contract. Now, whatever is my contract value, suppose it is of 1 crore today, I will add up the performance bonus of 3,60,000 into that, and then my total contract value will be 1 crore and 3,60,000. That will be my contract value, and this contract value will be recognized on POC or whatever basis that we will discuss later on. But my contract value came up to 1 crore 3 lakhs, which was previously only 1 crore. This can be huge quantums. I will say Dilip Buildcon has, if you will, this is available in annual report also. It has minimum performance bonuses of minimum of 10% of the contract value. Is their performance bonus, what they receive from the government. So that is the thing, it will increase your contract value. And since it has increased your contract value, your revenue will get impacted over the tenure of the contract and not only at the end of the contract. And this makes a huge difference. Second way, if the company has a past trend of always incurring certain liquidated damages or always giving certain discounts to the customers, then such discounts or liquidated damages also has to be incorporated in your contract on day one itself, and accordingly your contract value will be changed. Now, second concept is, will you apply, suppose the amount of your performance bonuses amounts to 10 lakh rupees. You will also apply the probability concept to the 10 lakh rupees. And according to the probability concept, whatever is the probability of receiving that 10 lakh, suppose based on past trend, 9 out of 10 contracts, you have received the performance bonus. So if you had entered into 10 contracts, out of that, under 9 contracts, you had received the performance bonus. So you will apply a 90% probability to the current amount of rupees 10 lakh, and that you will apply to the, or that you will add on to the contract value. So in our case, if 1 crore is the contract value and 10 lakhs is the performance bonus, which is 90% probable, in that cases, my contract value will become 1 crore and 9 lakh rupees. So this is a variable consideration which has to be factored in the contract value. Now, second thing is, in your Indian GAAP, your cash discounts given or any other discounts given or any dealer incentives given were appearing in the profit and loss, were appearing in the statement of profit and loss. Am I right? There used to be item called as incentives, cash discounts, which used to appear in the other expenses. Because of this variable consideration concept, everything has to be netted off against revenue and no such expenditure will appear in the other expenses. So suppose I'm Quick Heal India Limited, Quick Heal Technologies Limited, I sell antivirus. As soon as I sell antivirus, I give certain incentives to my dealers based on the targets. If I give such incentives to my dealers based on targets, this incentive amount is debited to my statement of profit and loss into other expenses. But because of this variable consideration concept, none of such expenditure will appear in other expenses, and these incentives will be netted off against my revenue from operations, that is my top line, and your top line will get impacted. So under Ind AS, you will not see any company which has such items in its other expenses account. And this has significant impact. It has impact on your ratios. It has impact upon what your top line looks like, how much your top line looks like. So this is a very important change which appears under Ind AS vis-a-vis your Indian GAAP or compared to your previous standards. Moving on to the next concept is, how will you estimate this variable consideration? So this is an example given. I hope everyone can see this example. Now in this case, there is a contract to build up a jet. We are just taking one example. There is a contract to build up the jet, and the fixed amount is 100 rupees, and the completion bonuses additional is 100 rupees. Now, your performance bonus is a certain amount. You would estimate the variable consideration based on the most likely concept. If it is most likely that you will receive the entire amount, then you will apply the entire, then you will add up the performance bonus to the original contract amount. If it is not, then in that cases, you will not add up the performance bonus into your original amount. This was the example we have previously already discussed in the example that I was discussing. I hope it is clear to you all, and if you have any query, then note it down because it is really important concept. Now further, this also we have discussed. if there is a constraint on variable consideration. What does it mean? That what is the probability or what is the likelihood that you will receive this variable consideration. In that cases, whatever is the likelihood based on the probability concept, that has to be applied to the variable consideration, and accordingly that amount will be added to your contract value. So if 100 rupees is the contract value and 75% is the amount that will be that is probable, so in that case only 75% will be added to your contract value and not entire 100 rupees. So you will decide there should not be significant reversal of revenue. For example, today you add up 100 rupees and later on you realize that you have received only 75. This cases should not happen. If such cases are happening, then your estimation is going significantly incorrect and you have to revisit your estimates made for the contracts. Next concept. So we had 4 concepts over here. Variable consideration we discussed, which is a really important concept. And the second concept we're discussing is significant financing component. So, what is a significant financing component? This concept we have already discussed in a different manner when we were discussing Ind AS 16, that was the deferred revenue. Secondly, we had also discussed yesterday in financial instruments this concept, and today it has its impact in revenue recognition. So that is the beauty of Ind AS. Every concept has linkage in some or the other standard. Okay, so let's discuss this concept. Suppose I am the service provider, and in my cases, what is happening is I am asking the customer, if my normal credit terms is say 3 months, in this present contract, the customer is gonna pay me after 2 years. And this is a special case. Now tell me, whatever amount will I charge to the customer if I'm receiving the payment upfront, vis-a-vis whatever amount I'll receive from the customer if the payment is to be received after 2 years, what will be the difference? If today I'm charging 1 crore of rupees for a particular contract where there is an upfront payment, obviously I'll add up certain margin to the customer if the customer is gonna pay me after a period of 2 years. If the customer is gonna pay me entire consideration after a period of 2 years. So this is a significant financing component if you have significant extended period for the receipt of the amount. In that cases, what do you have to do? You have to recognize the revenue at your cash selling price. So let's take up an example. So suppose if I'm selling a normal machinery at rupees 10 lakhs. I hope you can see my Excel sheet. If in normal cases I will sell the machinery at 10 lakh rupees, which has a 2 months of credit period. All right. However, there is a special case in which I have given the customer a credit period of 2 years. Okay. Now, even if it is not implicitly mentioned in the contract, I have raised the price to 12 lakhs to this customer. Since this is gonna pay me after 2 years, and which will logically happen as a prudent businessman, it is for sure gonna happen. Now, what will you do in such cases? Will you recognize the revenue at 12 lakhs and debit the debtors at 12 lakhs and this amount you will receive after 2 years? Or what will you do? You won't recognize the revenue at rupees 12 lakh, but you will recognize the revenue at rupees 10 lakhs, which is the cash selling price of the item. So debtors will be debited at 10 lakhs and revenue will be recognized at 10 lakhs. So this will be a revenue component. Then what will happen in the next 2 years? In the next 2 years, you will debit the amount to your finance income. So whatever is your interest component, so your debtors will be debited by, suppose in year 1, you will debit 1 lakh to your debtors and this will be debited to finance income amounting to rupees 1 lakh. This will be in year 1 and year 2. Similar will be the entries in year 1 and year 2, and accordingly your amount will reach to 12 lakhs. Your debtor amount will reach to 12 lakhs, but whereas there is a bifurcation between the revenue, only 10 lakh rupees has been recognized in revenue and balance has been recognized as a finance income. So this is the concept of significant financing arrangement. But what are the clauses or what are the peculiarities of this concept? For example, I'm into a construction industry or any other project driven industry. There is a peculiar clause in such kind of industries is retention money. So if the entire contract value is of rupees 1 crore In every billing, the entity will retain 10% of the billing and will pay me after completion of the contract. So in that cases, by default, my 10% of the contract value is getting retained. And you already know any such construction contracts last for a longer period, say 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. So I will get that amount after a period of 2 years or after a period of 3 years when the entire construction will get completed. Now, what to do in such cases? Whether you should discount the retention money. For that, you have to identify the nature or the purpose for which the amount has been deducted or the amount will be paid in a delayed manner. Now, the purpose of retention money is not to give a financing component or is not to give the financing benefit to the customer. Whereas the purpose of retention money is for a security purpose or for to give a guarantee that the I will complete all my performance obligations. If I do not complete any of my performance obligations, my customer can deduct that amount from my retention money. So that is the main purpose of the retention money. So if any contract has a purpose other than significant financing component, so delaying the payment is not on account of financing the customer, but it is for any other purpose such as guarantee or security or for any other purposes. In such cases, you won't discount the amount even if you're receiving that amount after a certain determined period. So that is a case for the purpose of the retention money. So if it is for the security purposes, in that cases, you won't discount the amount and the amount will appear in your balance sheet as it is without discounting. Because the purpose is not financing, the purpose is something other than financing. So moving ahead to the other part. So there are only two items which are remaining out of this transaction price, non-cash consideration. Now, if you remember, whoever had attended Ind AS 38, that is intangible asset standard, I had given an example. Today, I have constructed a road for the Pune Municipal Corporation. In return of giving money for my road, what did Municipal Corporation give is they give me advertisement rights on that particular road. So if I have a stretch of say 5 kilometers, on this 5 kilometers stretch of road, I can advertise anywhere. Now tell me what is the consideration given for this contract is? It is a non-cash consideration. So if you're giving a non-cash consideration in such cases, the revenue has to be measured at fair value. So fair value of asset given up or asset that has to be received, whichever is clearly determinable. So if I construct this road to normal third party who gives me revenue in cash, in that case, how much would have been the price charged? So if today that price would have been say 10 crore rupees, then I will recognize my revenue at 10 crore rupees, irrespective of it is not a present consideration to me. And that amount will be debited to the intangible asset, which is right to advertise on that road. So even if this is entire contract, which was on a non-cash consideration, but there might be a component of a contract. For example, today PMC agrees that your normal price is say 10 crores, but I will agree to give you only 5 crores. But for the balance component, I will agree that you can have an advertisement right. So here the revenue will not be at 5 crores, but will be at the fair value of the contract, that is the entire amount of 10 crores. So you have to estimate it at fair value, in spite of the fact that your cost to construct that road was only 8 crores. So you won't recognize that cost, but you will recognize at a fair value of the product or service delivered. Now the another part is consideration payable to the customer. If I have a transaction with the customer and certain part is given by customer itself. For example, today I'm running a turnkey project at certain place. If normally I ever run certain turnkey projects, the electricity, power, my stay arrangements of my employees has to be arranged by me itself. So it is an additional cost to me. But this is a special project. In case
Participant, just 2 minutes. There is some issue. We are solving. 2 minutes.
So, are you able to see me, Virag? The
Yes,
internet
yes.
is
Now
okay.
clear.
Are
Yes,
you able to
please
hear me?
continue. Now clear.
Yeah. Okay, fine.
Just 2-3 minutes. You can revise. I mean, that is
Yeah,
drop.
sure. I'll revisit. Yeah. Okay. Fine. So let's move ahead. So the concept that I discussed previously was non-cash consideration is what I was discussing previously. So in case you might have missed the voice, I'll just repeat quickly. So in cases where you are receiving a non-cash consideration, that is, you're receiving certain other asset in consideration. So this example we had discussed in Ind AS 38. That is, for example, if I'm constructing a road and in return I'm getting certain advertisement rights. So instead of receiving the entire amount to me as a transaction price, I am receiving the advertisement rights. So in that cases, I have to fair value the asset given, the services given to the customer, or the consideration received by the customer, whichever is clearly determinable. So whatever is clearly determinable, at that value, you will recognize the fair value of the revenue. So for example, if I would have sold that construction of road to any third party, I would have charged 10 crore of rupees. But with this PMC contract, the PMC is giving me only 5 crore rupees upfront, and for the balance portion, they are giving me advertisement rights. So in that cases, my revenue won't be only 5 crore rupees, but it would be fair value of the contract, which is rupees 10 crores. This was about the non-cash consideration. So now we have discussed three parts of the revenue recognition. First was identifying the contract. Second was identifying the performance obligations in the contract. Third was determining the variable considerations. And now the fourth step is allocating the transaction price. When will the question of allocating the transaction price arise? The question of allocating the transaction price will arise only if there are two separate performance obligations in a single contract. So, if there is single performance obligation, then the question of allocating the transaction price does not arise. So, for example, in a previous case, which we discussed as an example, my installation service is regarded as a separate performance obligation, and my sale of machinery is been regarded as a separate performance obligation. But in contract, they have stated, for example, a single value of rupees 1 crore, or they might have stated different values in the contract. They might have stated that 80 lakhs is for sale of machinery and 20 lakhs is for the installation service. So I'll just note it down. Everybody can see my Excel sheet. So machinery sale is amounting to 80 lakhs as per the contract, and my installation service is amounting to 20 lakhs as per the contract. But what does the standard say is, don't go explicitly by what is mentioned in the contract. It might happen that this allocation is not appropriate. Just because client has to or customer has to recognize more revenue upfront, or customer has to collect more revenue upfront, that is why he might have allocated more part to the machinery. It can happen, and lesser part to installation, because installation comes at the end. So the standard says that even if there is a bifurcation mentioned in the contract, don't go as per the bifurcation, but you have to go for as per the market approach. If as good as this machinery you would have sold individually without the installation, what would have been the contract price? So if individually I sell the machinery, I'd sell it at 60 lakhs. And if I sell it with installation values to 40 lakhs. So in that cases, the real bifurcation between the goods and the service component will be 60 and 40, and not what does the contract say. And the second case might be that the contract has not given bifurcation itself. Since the contract has not given the bifurcation, you purely have to go with the concept of what would be the market approach. That is, individually, if I go and sell the services, how much do I charge to the customer? So this is about allocating the transaction price. So your first step or first method could be, as I discussed, adjustment as per the market approach. What is the second concept? If you don't know, now you would say, I don't sell it individually in the market. What to do in that cases? If I don't sell it individually in the market, what will I do? I'll do what is the expected cost plus reasonable margin. So I as a company, I will know expected cost for both the items, and I will add up certain reasonable margin over those expected cost. The third is a residual approach. That is, you value one component of the performance obligation, and the residuary is allocated to the second component. But the standard does not really encourage this concept. This approach will be used only if the first two are not clearly achievable, and even if you say expected cost plus margin won't be, there won't be ever any case where cost plus margin approach also won't work. So residually approach is not really encouraged, and it has to be used in a very limited cases. So this is about allocating the transaction price. So the standard agenda you remember, or standard principle you remember of the contract is, you don't have to purely see what is written in the contract, and you have to go as per the logical allocation of the amount to different performance obligations. Now moving ahead to the last step, which is step 5, timing of recognition of revenue, which is the most important step. Now we have decided how many are the performance obligations. We have decided what is the transaction price for each performance obligation. Now we will decide what is the timing of recognition of revenue. Now your timing of recognition of revenue can be in two parts. First is at point in time, and second would be over point in time. And this has to be decided for each performance obligation. For each performance obligation, you have to decide whether revenue has to be recognized at point in time and over the period of time. So as the name suggests, where the revenue has to be recognized at point in time, in that cases, when all your performance obligation, your entire performance obligation will be completed, after that, the control will be transferred to the customer and your revenue will be recognized. Whereas in second case, which is over period in time, your revenue will be recognized over the period of the contract. But how will you decide? This was very simple. This was even there in your AS7 and AS9. But what is different over here? The difference is the conditions based on which you decide whether it is at point in time or over a period in time. So let's move ahead. There are 3 conditions. If your contract is fitting into either of these conditions, you have to recognize the revenue over a period of time. If none of these conditions are getting satisfied, you are not fitting into any of these conditions, in such cases, revenue has to be recognized at a point in time. And this is mandatory in nature. You cannot say that I have to optionally recognize the revenue at point in time. So if it is fitting into over a period of time, you have to recognize the revenue over the period of time. Now let's see what is the first condition. The first condition is customer simultaneously receives and consumes the benefit as the entity performs. What is the example? For example, I am rendering a freight or transportation services. If I want to transport a particular goods from India to Singapore, in that case, as soon as I cover certain distance, as soon as I cover 5,000 kilometers, the customer is consuming that benefit. How is the customer consuming the benefit? The goods have already reached halfway and only balance half is remaining. So if the goods have already reached halfway, in such cases, even if you cancel the contract, the goods have to be traveled from that half to the Singapore location. Correct? So as soon as I travel even 2 kilometers, customer has consumed that service of 2 kilometers. Okay. So this is a classic example of the first case where you will recognize the revenue over the period of time. So here you won't recognize the revenue when the goods will reach the port of Singapore, but you will recognize the revenue on a period of time. If it takes 60 days for the purpose of traveling the goods from India to Singapore, you will recognize the revenue over the period of 60 days. This can be based on daily basis or what basis, that's a different case, but you will recognize the revenue over the period of time. What is the second condition or a second case? Asset is as soon as as soon as the asset is built, the customer is controlling that asset. So what the condition is, customer controls the asset as the entity creates or enhances that asset. So what does it mean? For example, I'm constructing an asset, I'm constructing a building at the customer's site. Now, tell me, as soon as it is the site of the customer is entirely controlling that site location. Today, if I'm constructing a building and I've completed a first floor, in that cases, who is controlling that first floor? Since it is the location of the customer, the asset is also controlled by the customer. Today, if I cancel the contract, I cannot say I will pick up the building and I'll shift it somewhere else. It is not possible because of the nature of the asset and because of the location at which the asset is constructed. So generally, whichever assets are built on the customer side, it is assumed or it is presumed that customer is controlling the asset as and when entity is building that asset. So there are various contracts. For example, listed company Thermax builds up various thermal power plants which are at the customer's location. In that cases, this condition is getting satisfied, which is customer is controlling the asset as and when the entity is creating or enhancing the asset. Praj Industries Limited, they built up alcohol manufacturing plants. Those plants are built up at the customer location, and these plants are controlled by the customer as soon as they are getting developed or they are getting enhanced at the customer location. And this is purely because of the location of the goods. The last condition, which is really important, is the entity's performances does not create an asset with an alternate use, and there is right to payment for the performance to date. I'll explain it. What does it mean? The asset which is getting constructed is of a very specialized nature. It is such of a specialized nature is you cannot easily have an alternate use for that asset. This is the part one. And the second part is you have right to payment for the performance till date. So if you have completed 50% of the project, you have right to bill for the 50% of the project, or you have a right to collect the amount up to the 50% of the value of the contract. Okay, let's take an example for this. For example, there is and one more thing over here is, one more peculiarity of this condition is, you have right to payment not only for the cost, it is right to payment of the contract value. What does it mean? It is including the margin component also. Now let's take the example. Now it will be very clear to you how to answer for this example. Now in a present case, there is a contract to build up a building. Okay, customer can cancel the contract with a 30 days notice. But even if the customer cancels the contract, I have right to payment to cover costs incurred if the contract is cancelled. Now tell me over here, it is a specialized equipment. So this entire contract is getting fit up in the third condition since it is a specialized equipment. But the second part is you have right to payment of the contract value. That means it should include margins also and not only up to the cost. But here what does the contract says? You have right to payment to cover costs incurred in the contract. So your second part of condition is not getting met, and accordingly you cannot fit in this part, and this is not a revenue to be recognized over the period of time because the third condition is not getting met and it doesn't fit into first and second condition. If the contract was saying that you have a right to recover cost plus margins, then it was fitting in the third part of over the time recognition of revenue, and you can recognize the revenue over a period of time. It is really important. Each and every part of this overtime criteria is really important because it significantly changes how you recognize the revenue. Moving ahead, do special considerations. Now, before we move into the special considerations, we will just discuss all our previous examples so you have a better idea of why did we divide into two performance obligations and how will you recognize the revenue in all such cases. Now, first example we discussed was of hotel and the loyalty points. Now, today, even if I'm collecting rupees 10,000 for the purpose of hotel for one room night, but you have to allocate certain portion out of rupees 10,000 for the loyalty points earned by the customer. And when the customer will come and utilize such loyalty points, at that point in time, you will recognize the revenue for such loyalty points. So for example, out of 10,000, I allocate amount of rupees say 1,000 for the purpose of loyalty points, because I get points equal to 10% of the room rent. So this 1,000 rupees will be deferred and you will recognize the revenue only of rupees 9,000 on this day one. This 1,000 will be recognized when the customer comes and utilizes this loyalty point. So this will be deferred over that period. Second example is, and please remember, under Indian GAAP, there was no mandate for such deferral. Many companies used to recognize entire 10,000 rupees upfront, and whenever a customer comes and utilizes such loyalty points, at such point in time, they used to recognize the reduced revenue. So this is a difference of accounting what everybody used to follow. Second is, if you have a club and you have a lifetime membership of that club. So today I'm paying entire fees upfront and I have the lifetime membership. So even for such kind of contracts, many people under Indian GAAP used to recognize entire revenue upfront. But over here, I have an obligation to give the club services to the customer over his entire life, because I have recovered lifetime membership from the customer. So it is mandatory for me to give all the services for the tenure of the club, for the lifetime of the members of that club. So in such cases, what will you do? If I have received, suppose, upfront membership fees of rupees 15 lakhs, if I'm PYC Club of Pune, I'm receiving upfront membership fees of 15 lakhs. And I'm receiving just minimal annual maintenance of rupees 12,000. This annual maintenance by default will go in the year in which you are charging for such annual maintenance. But what will happen of this 15 lakh rupees? This has to be deferred on the expected life of the customers. So what will you do is, you will assume my expected life. So suppose for example, you assume my expected life of 60 years. Whichever customer have joined at the age of 25, the entire fees of 15 lakh will be deferred over a period of 60 minus 25 years. That is, it will be deferred over a period of 35 years. Whereas if a customer is joining at the age of 50, then the entire fees would be deferred over a period of 10 years. So in short, you decide on an average expected life of the customer at up to what age the customer utilizes the club, or what is the Indian expected lives of the people. As per that life, you will amortize the entire fees. So this is again a difference, and this is difference between which people used to do the accounting. Third example, I am an antivirus provider. I am certain, say, NetSuite or QuickHeal antivirus for your laptops and mobiles. Now, as soon as you buy QuickHeal for a period of 3 years, what happens is, QuickHeal has a mandate to give you upgrades for a period of 3 years. Without upgrades, there is no value to that software. I mean, you can still use the antivirus, but you are not buying the antivirus without upgrades. So in that cases, you have to allocate certain value to the upgrades that has to be provided over a period of 3 years. And even if you're paying for the antivirus upfront, that is rupees 1,000, you have to defer certain amount for the purpose of upgrades. Say 200 you will defer for the upgrades. Upfront you will recognize only 100 rupees of revenue, and as soon as you give the upgrades over a period of 3 years, you will recognize this revenue of rupees 200. I hope everybody is able to see my screen and everybody has understood the Excel examples that I'm discussing. Last example, very much common and would have been used very much popularly by you all, Paytm cashbacks. So if today I'm buying anything of rupees 1,000 on Paytm, I'm getting 100 rupees as a cashback. So in such cases, what to do? This 100 rupees I will utilize in the next product. Okay. And at that point in time, if my next product is costing rupees 500, then I will pay only 400 to Paytm. How to recognize the revenue in such cases? The first way in which you can recognize the revenue is, on day one, you recognize only 900 rupees of revenue, that is 100 minus 1000 minus 100. Or the second way is, standard has not given exact method in which you have to recognize the revenue. But again, a second logical way is, this 100 rupees of cashback has to be allocated between 1000 and the next product of rupees 500, and based on the value of product you are allocating this discount or this cashback given by Paytm, and accordingly the allocation is rupees 67 and 33. So on day one you will recognize a revenue of 1000 minus 67, and when your second sale happens of rupees 500 you will recognize a revenue of 500 minus 33. So it is an on and whole, this will be the bifurcation between the revenue recognition. So this was all about why do you have to recognize different performance obligations and how does revenue recognition gets impacted based on these performance obligations. One more thing, or one more classic example what I want to tell you is, one of the conversions that we did is in our practical cases, in the main entity they had contract to provide the goods. So if I'm a turnkey project, in that cases in my company, XYZ company, I have a contract to deliver only goods. So that contract had to deliver drawings, its roadmap, and the goods required for the project, for the turnkey project. I had formed a subsidiary company in which the subsidiary company was required to give the installation services of that turnkey project. So goods I will supply, but erection and installation will be given by my subsidiary company. So in such cases, what to do? In my main parent company, which is XYZ Limited, I don't have this contract itself of subsidiary company. So for me, there is a contract only of providing the goods. So I will apply only this providing of goods contract on a over the period in time. But when I will prepare consolidated financial statements, in such cases, your entire revenue recognition would be for the entire, both the contracts put together as a whole, you will recognize the revenue. So what does it change is, tell me one thing, you apply POC on two different contracts in two different ways, and you apply percentage of completion to entire contract as one contract, the percentage of completion changes. And since the percentage of completion changes, the recognition of revenue or the amount at which revenue is recognized will change significantly, and this has given a huge impact to the company that we were transiting from Indian GAAP to Ind AS. So under Indian GAAP, there was no such requirement to change the revenue in their CFS. But here, due to this standard, they had a significant impact not in their standalone financial statements, but in their consolidated financial statements, because from a CFS point of view, both these contracts were combined together and it was considered as one contract. Now, moving ahead to the special considerations of revenue recognition. Significant financing component we have discussed in detail previously. Second special consideration we'll discuss is extended warranty. Now, if you have a standard, suppose I'm Tata Motors, I'm selling say Maruti Suzuki, or I'm selling certain Tata Nano car today, and with that Nano car I've given certain warranty of 2 years or 3 years, I would say 3 years and 36,000 miles is the standard warranty given. But what do I do is I also give an extended warranty to the customer with an additional charge of 3 years. So for 3 years I've given them an extended warranty. Now tell me how to recognize the revenue for this particular contract. Now the standard says that this is a special additional guidance given by the contract. This is none of the interpretations. The standard says that your standard warranty and your sale of main car is one single performance obligation, because your standard warranty is given for the manufacturing defects which existed in the car. If there are any manufacturing defects, for that purposes the extended warranty is given, or the standard warranty is given. But the extended warranty is at the discretion of the customer. The customer might take it, might not take it. It is for the additional security or additional safety of the customer. And for that, you're charging an additional amount also. So it is as good as you're giving additional maintenance services to the customer, so that for the next 3 years after completion of standard warranty, if there is any damage or if there is any difficulty in the car, in that cases, it can be repaired from the Tata Motors. In that cases, the entire amount of the car with the standard warranty amount has to be recognized as soon as you sell the car, okay, including the standard warranty. You make a provision for warranty. So your revenue appears in total, but your provision for warranty appears. But In case of extended warranty, you do not recognize the revenue until and unless you recognize the revenue over the period of these 3 years, and you do not recognize the revenue on day one when you sell the car. So for example, if I sell the car in 2015 and the standard warranty period is elapsing on 2018, then this revenue will come from 18 to 3 years ahead, that is 18, 19, 20, this revenue will come up. 15, 16, 17 was under the standard warranty, and 18, 19, 20 will be under this extended warranty, and revenue of rupees 5,000 will be amortized over these 3 years. So I hope the concept of extended warranty is clear. It is not merged with the original value of the car. Now moving on to the last concept of the standard, that is the contract costs. Now this concept was discussed or was asked by some of the other participants also previously. There are two concepts, that is cost incurred to enter into the contract and cost incurred to fulfill the contract. What are the examples? Cost incurred to enter into the contract means, for example, you might have given certain commission fees, you might have given certain brokerage, that is cost incurred to enter into the contract. So in such cases, the standard says that if you have incurred certain costs incurred for the contract, you can capitalize such costs as contract cost and you can amortize it over the period of the contract. So under Indian GAAP, you used to debit it to P&L as and when you incur the cost. Whereas under the standard, you have an option to capitalize the cost. It's not an option, it's a mandatory thing. You have to capitalize the cost and amortize it over the tenure of the contract. Second criteria given by the contract, given by the standard is cost incurred to fulfill the contract. What does it mean? If you have incurred certain cost to fulfill the contract, example, today I'm a construction company. If I have to construct certain project of flats, in that cases I have to make certain stay arrangement of my employees. So I make certain admin office, I make certain area for my employees to stay over there. I make up certain accounts office over there. I built up stores over there. Now these are the costs incurred to fulfill that contract. In such cases, these costs can be capitalized and can be amortized over the tenure of the contract. So these are contract costs. And one more thing you have to look over is the materiality. In many cases, these costs are not very much material in nature compared to the value of the contract. And based on the concept of materiality also, you can ignore this cost and debit it to the P&L as and when they are incurred. So don't go into much of complexities if the cost is not material. If it is too much immaterial in nature, then you can ignore this component also and you can debit it to P&L. So in my practical cases, wherever I have implemented Ind AS and wherever even I've reviewed, so I've reviewed various companies, in majority of the companies, nowhere I could find this cost material in nature. But still, if the company that you are referring to, in that cases, you can find out where these costs are material in nature. And in that cases, you can apply this concept. Moving on to the disclosures. Over here, Ind AS 115 has certain exhaustive disclosures. So here you have to divide your revenue. It is called as disaggregation of revenue. Your entire revenue have to be divided into certain parts. It might depend upon you can divide it as per products and services given by you. You can divide it geographically. You can divide it as per the point of time of recognition of revenue. So in any manner, you have to disaggregate the revenue based on which your company is evaluated. So they have given certain parameters based on service, geographical location, based on the customers. So if you have certain types of customers, say in case of motor cars, you have various types of customers. So you have heavy motors, you have light-weighted motors. So there are different categories of customers which the Tata Motors is addressing. So it might be based on types of customers. You have to disaggregate the revenue. And in such cases, you don't have any difference in the revenue. You can show it as a one line item. Then you have to show which are the performance obligations involved, on what basis you have decided the performance obligation, what are the significant judgments in that, what are the contract balances. In such cases, how did you decide whether you have to recognize the revenue over a period in time or at point in time? What are the uncertainties involved in recognition of revenue? These all disclosures you have to give it in detail. To have a grip over the disclosures, as I always say, refer to any listed company's annual report, refer famous companies, don't refer any, so you can refer Infosys, you can refer any such bigger companies and have a look into what kind of disclosures are given, because disclosures, just reading the disclosures won't give you a grip over the disclosures. So this was about Ind AS 115. Any further clarifications or any queries, you can give it to me. You can raise questions over here. Due to some technical glitch, I couldn't receive yesterday's queries. So whichever participants who had raised queries yesterday, I will reply to it today, by tonight or by tomorrow morning, because due to some technical issues in the software, we couldn't receive the queries raised. Today's queries, you can post it over here and I might either discuss it in the class or I will reply to you by way of emails. Moving ahead to our next standard of today, which is consolidated financial statement or consolidation, Ind AS 110. Yesterday, we have already discussed Ind AS 103, which is business combinations. So that is a replica or a standard, not replica, but a standard which has to be compared with AS 14 of Indian GAAP. And here we are discussing consolidation, how to do consolidation, what are the parameters of consolidation first of all, and what is the, how do you consolidate joint ventures and associates. Okay, the basic fundamental guidance what has been provided under this standard is what is control, and they have given a much wider definition under this standard as compared to what you had it under your Indian GAAP. So here they are given much wider definition and what is the significance of such control and how will it create an impact or how will it differ or how will it differentiate your CFS as it appears under Ind AS and how it was appearing under Indian GAAP. Previously, under Indian GAAP, you had a standard rules. If the shareholding is exceeding 50%, you have to consolidate. If you are controlling the composition of board of directors, you have to consolidate. There were certain standard principles given under the Indian GAAP. Whereas here, you have been given guidance based on conditions. If these conditions are getting fulfilled, only then you are controlling the entity and only then you have to consolidate the entity in your books of accounts. If these conditions are not getting fulfilled, then you are not controlling the entity. So moving ahead with what are the conditions given. For the purpose of consolidation, first is you should have a power over the entity. There should be variability of returns, and using that power, you can differ or you can change this variability of returns. By these pure names, you don't understand anything. I will give you examples, and based on examples, your concept has to be built into what is different under the standard. So, first of all, what you have to decide is, for whatever purpose the entity is created, who is deciding or who is the main decision maker for those activities. So, for example, if the entity is built up for manufacturing activities, so who is deciding how to allocate the resources? Who is deciding timing of manufacture? Who is deciding how much to manufacture? Which entity or who is having control over this relevant decisions? So whoever is having the power over this relevant decisions have to be identified. Now I'll take examples. So somewhere I'll take common examples and somewhere I'll take difficult or uncommon cases. But this is relevant for the purpose of understanding the concept. Now, purpose of entities sometimes might be very simple, but in some cases it might be very much difficult. For example, today I'm ABC, a sponsoring bank, and I have created an investment entity which is XYZ. Now, the purpose of this investment entity is to invest into bonds of certain companies. Now, when the purpose of the entity is to invest into bonds of the companies, in the contract itself, in certain arrangement, I have specified that sponsoring bank has selected certain bonds and XYZ can invest into only such bonds. Okay. Now, in these cases, the sponsoring bank, whether it is shareholder of XYZ or not a shareholder of XYZ, the main activity or the main relevant activity of XYZ has been controlled by the sponsoring bank. So the sponsoring bank has the power to decide which bonds XYZ should invest into and which bonds XYZ should not invest into. So since here purpose of this investment entity is purely to invest into the bonds, you have to decide who has the power to decide which bonds to invest into, who has the power to sell off certain bonds, who has the power to invest into new bonds. So whatever are the relevant activities of the entity or whatever is the purpose of the entity, you have to decide who has power to decide or to control such relevant activities. This is the first part. Now, in such cases, relevant activity that you have discussed, the bond selection process, it can be different. Now, the main motto or the main principle behind the standard also you remember is, as a standard rule, whoever holds more than 50% in any particular entity controls that entity. But the standard says that it might not always be that case. In certain cases, even if you're not controlling 50%, even if you're not holding 50% of the shares, you might control the entity, and other way around is also possible. You're controlling more than 50% of the shares, but still the control is not possible. So here we'll discuss examples for all such cases. Now another example. I am XYZ Limited. I am holding 45% shares of PQR Limited. However, I am having power to appoint all the board of directors of PQR Limited. So all the board of directors of PQR has to be appointed by XYZ Limited. The contract, they have developed a contract which says that if you have to sell more than 50% of the shares, 50% of the assets of the company, only in such case you have to go back to the shareholders. Now tell me, in such cases, is XYZ controlling PQR? As per Indian GAAP, since XYZ is not holding more than 50%, it used to not control PQR. But over here, XYZ is having the power to appoint all of the members of the BOD. And since it has the power to appoint all the BOD, it is indirectly controlling the PQR, since all the activities of PQR are being controlled by the board of directors. The clause of more than 50% is just a protective clause, so that the board of directors do not get up and sell the entire company. So in cases you're selling more than 50% of the assets, only in that cases you have to come back to the shareholders. That is one of the case in the case that we're discussing. Second example is of a casting vote. What relevance does it make? XYZ is holding 50% in PQR. The directors are XYZ has 4 directors. The bank has appointed 2 directors, and there is a seed investor who has appointed 2 directors in the company. However, in cases where there is a tie, in that cases, the director of XYZ Limited has a casting vote and he can exercise a casting vote. Now, in these cases, even if XYZ is holding only 50%, but in all relevant activities, XYZ has a additional say. So in such cases, it can result into XYZ is controlling PQR even if it is not holding more than 50%. This is one of the case. So in short, what the concept of control says is, don't go purely by way of exact shareholding in the company. Go by way of what are the relevant activities of the company, who is having power to direct such relevant activities, and because of such relevant activities, your returns should vary, and you can use this power to vary the returns. You have to just look into who has the power and whether he is able to use such power to vary the returns of the company. We'll see the second example, option to purchase. Now we'll discuss the example over here. There is a shareholder XYZ. Presently, he is holding only 45% in a specialized company named J. But XYZ has an option to purchase additional 55% at any point in time. So at any point in time, XYZ can exercise the option and he can subscribe to additional 55% shares of company J. Now, purely if these were the terms of the contract, what would have you done? Since XYZ has an option to exercise the shares, you will decide or you will see whether the option is in the money option or it is out of the money option. What does it mean? We have discussed this concept yesterday in the financial instruments. In the money option means what? XYZ, XYZ is in a favorable position to exercise that options. So for example, if the book value of company is say 10 rupees, but I have option to subscribe to the shares at rupees 8. So in such cases, XYZ will decide whether it is favorable for to subscribe at rupees 8. And if it is in a financially better position, then our option is in the money option. In the money means what? It is a beneficial option. However, there can be a case where option is out of the money. What does it mean? If the market price of Z Limited is 100 rupees, but you have option to subscribe the shares at rupees 150, will logically you subscribe to the shares? In market you are getting it at 100 rupees, and here because of your option you are getting it at 150 rupees. It is nowhere logical, and because of that it is not financially feasible, and accordingly your option is out of the money option, and in such cases your option is not having any value. So if purely these were the terms of the contract, that you have option to exercise the number of shares and it is in the money option, in that cases, even if presently XYZ is holding only 45% of shares, but since XYZ has a in the money option, indirectly what is happening is XYZ is controlling Z Limited. But let's move on to the second clauses of the contract. The contract says that, or the position of the company is such that if XYZ exercises its option, all the directors of the company, whoever are having specialized knowledge of the company, will leave the organization. So that is the situation of the company. Now really tell me, is it beneficial or will XYZ really exercise that option? As soon as XYZ exercises its option, all the directors having the technical knowledge will leave the organization. So in short, because of this nature, the option of the XYZ will never be exercised, and accordingly XYZ is not controlling Z Limited because of this clause. Okay, moving ahead to next example. XYZ, continuing the same example, XYZ is having 45% in J Limited. XYZ is having option to buy 55% additional shares, but XYZ is too much into financial trouble. XYZ is not having that much financial ability itself to buy additional 55% shares. It is not having that much net worth itself. So accordingly, in such cases, since XYZ is not having the financial ability to subscribe to such 55% additional shares, the option is not a valid option, and accordingly XYZ is not controlling Z Limited. Okay, and we have discussed in the money and out of the money option. Now, moving ahead to the next part. This is again a practical case. You will find out also this case in listed companies. Now, I have invested 55% in PQR Limited. Okay. Now, by normal 55%, you would say that XYZ is controlling PQR. But I have developed a separate shareholding agreement, and as per that shareholding agreement, I will not exercise any voting rights with respect to this 55% shares. And this is a practical case. If you will see a company called as Kirloskar Brothers Limited, and this is mentioned in the annual report, Kirloskar Brothers holds 20% in Kirloskar Industries Limited, but they have developed a shareholding agreement based on which Kirloskar Brothers have said that we will never exercise this 22% shares. Now, in such cases, if you go purely by the shareholding, Kirloskar Brothers is associate of Kirloskar Industries Limited. But since there is an agreement that they will never exercise this voting rights, the company is not an associate of the Kirloskar Brothers Limited. So that is why this, even if you are holding shares, this shareholding agreement has negated this voting rights. So this is mainly about the conditions. So this standard indirectly says that don't only go based on the shareholding, see other relevant factors, see what is the substance of the arrangement, and see in substance who is controlling the entire entity. We'll see another example of de facto control. What does this mean is, if I have only 45% shares in one company, but the rest 55% are so much dispersed into various parts that none of the person can come up and individually control the company. So even a single person is not holding more than 1% shares. So in such cases, what to do? In such cases, you have a de facto control. What does it mean is, none of the other shareholders, none of the other 55% can come together and vote against this 45% because they are very much dispersed in nature. Everybody is holding 0.1, 0.5% of the shares, and I am holding 45% of the shares. So in such cases, in spite of not holding more than 50% of the shares, still there might be a case where you are controlling the company. So this is about how to decide whether you are controlling the company or not, and what are the parameters given for the control. Moving ahead to the next part is, what is the significant influence? So similarly over here, the definition of significant influence is given. If you are holding 20% of shares, more than 20% of the shares, you might have a significant influence over the company. But this significant influence can be, you might have a reputable presumption that in spite of holding more than 20%, you are not having a significant influence over the company. And the factors such as representation on the board of directors, decision making, how did the material transactions are taking place, how there is change of managerial personnel, these factors will decide whether you are having a significant influence over the company or not. So these are the cases over for the significant influence. And then we have a concept of joint control. Ind AS 111 has defined what is a joint arrangement, what is a joint control, and how do you account for such joint arrangements. Now they have given certain criteria how to define these concepts. Wherever you have joint control, you have to divide such entities into whether it is a joint arrangement or whether it is a joint venture. So wherever it is a joint venture, you have to consolidate it in a consolidated financial statements. But in cases where it is a joint arrangement only, in such cases, you will combine it in your standalone financial statements itself. You don't have to include it in your CFS, but it will be a part of your SFS itself. So they are given parameters about how to decide which is a joint venture and which is a joint arrangement. So these are the parameters given by the standard. One of the most important parameter is the legal form of the entity. If legal form of the entity is such that if you cannot have a distinct legal, you cannot establish a distinct legal entity, in such cases it is by default a joint arrangement and it will be included in your standalone financial statements itself. Whereas in cases where you can establish a different legal form of that entity, in such cases it is a joint control. And the standard has specifically said that a partnership firm cannot be said as having a different legal entity because the partners are no longer separate from the partnership firm. So in cases where the company is invested into a partnership firm, by default it is a joint arrangement and it will be a part of the same standalone financial statements itself, and you don't have to include in the CFS. It will be a part of SFS itself and don't wait until the CFS. Now, another parameter is, under Indian GAAP, you had a different method of accounting. For the purpose of joint ventures, you used to do a proportionate consolidation. Whereas under Ind AS, for the associate as well as joint ventures, you have to do equity accounting. So whatever equity accounting is similar to what you used to do for an associate, same you have to do under for the joint venture, and there is no concept of proportionate accounting. So how do you do equity accounting under the standard is, whatever is your initial cost of the investment, add up your share in the comprehensive income. So if you're holding say 25% of the total comprehensive income, you will add up 25% of the company in which you have invested, less any dividends paid, that will be your carrying amount. And this concept is applicable to the joint venture as well as the associates. So in your consolidated financial statements, wherever you have a joint venture, first you have to deconsolidate that joint venture from your company, and then you have to equity account for that joint venture into your books of accounts. This is a bigger change due to which your consolidated financial statements can change to a significant extent. Because in proportionate consolidation method, you used to take your proportionate share in each and every item and accordingly used to consolidate. If property, plant and equipment is amounting to rupees 100, you used to add up 50 rupees to your property, plant and equipment. If your total assets are 1000, you used to add up 500 to your total assets. And this is what will significantly change because a bigger chunk will be removed from your financial statements and it will be just a equity accounting. So in equity accounting, your nothing changes, just your investment value keeps on increasing on a periodic basis. As soon as the entity earns profit, your investment value keeps on increasing. This is again a bigger change between Indian GAAP and Ind AS. Second important concept is, this concept is linked to whatever we had discussed in Ind AS 103, which is business combinations. Any entity, if today I'm investing into a particular entity and on account of my investment, I have gained a control over that entity. Okay. If I've gained a control over the entity, in such cases, how do I consolidate? I consolidate and calculate goodwill based on the fair value of the assets and liabilities acquired. So previously under Indian GAAP, the consolidation was not based on the principle of fair value. It was purely the book values of the subsidiary company that were consolidated in the consolidated financial statements. So we used to take holding company's book value, subsidiaries company's book values and add up. But in case of Ind AS, you have to take the fair values of the assets and liabilities acquired, and based on this fair values, you will gonna compute the goodwill amount. Now you will ask a question: what happens if for the old subsidiaries which have been already acquired? This concept was also discussed yesterday. You have an exemption in Ind AS 101 that you do not restate any business combinations that have already occurred in the past. So if already there is a subsidiary, this entity was my subsidiary before transiting into Ind AS, in such cases, you will not change anything for such subsidiary companies, and whatever consolidation method is going on as per your previous GAAP, that will be continued same for the future periods, and your goodwill will be at the same amount. Whereas if today, after transacting into Ind AS, you acquire a particular control on any particular subsidiary company, in such cases that consolidation has to be made based on the fair values of the assets and liabilities acquired, and based on these fair values, you are gonna compute the goodwill amount. Another case that we discussed yesterday is this goodwill amount won't be amortized. Whatever goodwill arises on consolidation is never amortized and it is only tested for impairment. Now moving ahead to the next part is, before discussing the standalone financial statements, one more part we will discuss is, what if you withdraw a certain portion of your shares, or what if you gain certain additional stake in the company? For example, I'll just discuss this by way of an example, writing it over here. Today I'm having 60% in any particular company. Okay, I'm holding 60% of company XYZ. Now when I'm acquiring this 60% in company XYZ, my goodwill amount was rupees 10 lakhs. Okay. Now what happened in next year, I acquired additional 20% in this company. The fair value of net assets for this 20% was say rupees 5 lakhs. Okay. And I paid amount of rupees 7 lakhs for this 20% share. Okay. Now under Indian GAAP, you used to recognize additional goodwill of rupees 2 lakh. So this was your additional goodwill amount, since you have paid more than the fair value of the net assets. Whereas under Ind AS, there is a different concept. What does Ind AS say is, you see what has happened to your control. Now over here, previously also you were controlling the entity, and after this additional stake also you are only controlling the entity. If there is no change in the control happened, in that cases you will never recognize additional goodwill. So your goodwill amount will be fixed to rupees 10 lakh and there will be no change in the amount of goodwill. So what will happen to this additional amount paid? This additional amount paid will be adjusted in your reserves. And there will be no additional goodwill created. This amount will be debited to your reserves and surpluses. So this is again a bigger change. whichever companies will be transiting from Indian GAAP to Ind AS, this will be a bigger change for such kind of companies. That is the additional stake acquired. For such additional stake, there will never be any kind of additional goodwill into the company. Moving ahead to the standalone financial statements. In the standalone financial statements, as per Ind AS 27, you have option to recognize the investment in the associate or joint venture or subsidiary. For such investments, you have two options. The first option is to recognize such investment at cost, or the second option is to recognize such investments in accordance with Ind AS 109. So Ind AS 109 is nothing but the financial instrument standard. So that is, in such cases, you will fair value that investments through the statement of profit and loss. If you are using the option given under Ind AS 109, every disclosure, measurement, requirements will be as per the Ind AS 109. But if you are using the option of cost, Ind AS 109 will not be applicable to such kind of companies and to such kind of investments. And these investments will be carried at cost itself. No disclosures, none of the requirements of Ind AS 109 will be applicable. Neither classification, measurement, or disclosures, none of these concepts of Ind AS 109 will be applicable to the company. So please remember this concept. Many people raise a query that it is an investment, it is an equity instrument. So why doesn't it fall under Ind AS 109? This is because there is a scope exclusion from Ind AS 27 that if you're deciding or if you're taking an option to measure at cost, in such cases, the concept or the principle of 109 is not applicable and you're completely removed out of that standard. I hope it is clear to you all. And now quickly we'll revise what are the differences between the previous standard, the previous consolidation standard and the new standard. So previously, under your previous Indian GAAP consolidation standard, you had only strict principles of consolidation. Over here, you have a rule for consolidation, that is power over the entity, variability of returns, and usage of this power to decide the variability of the return. This is one change. That is why there are many companies which will come under the scope of consolidation. There are many companies which will be removed out of the scope of consolidation. Second difference is the goodwill. Goodwill is never tested for impairment. So accordingly, goodwill on consolidation will also be never tested for impairment. The third case is the case that we discussed right now. If there is increase in control, if there is additional control gained over the company, in such cases, under Indian GAAP previously you used to recognize additional goodwill, and under Ind AS, if there is no change in control, you won't recognize any additional goodwill in the financial statements. It will purely be as it is, how it was appearing earlier. Fourth difference is, under Indian GAAP, the joint ventures were proportionately consolidated in the books of accounts, whereas under Ind AS, there will be equity accounting method and there won't be any kind of proportionate consolidation. Now, one more concept that I want to just quickly link to this standard is, we discussed certain deferred tax implications. Now, here we are discussing how you are equity accounting it. So for every equity accounting concept, there will be a deferred tax which will arise in the books of accounts, which we discussed on day 3. Whichever participants were there on day 3, please try to link this consolidation method and the deferred tax concept for this. And accordingly, you will realize whatever we had discussed in day 3. So in associate or in equity accounting, to whatever amount your investment value has increased. So here you added your share of comprehensive income. Due to this addition of share of comprehensive income, there will be a deferred tax liability which will be arising in your books of accounts. And based on the conditions mentioned in the standard of Ind AS 12, that is income taxes, you will decide whether deferred tax liability has to be recognized on this or it has not to be recognized on this component. So here we are linking the deferred taxes standard also. So today in this consolidated financial statements, we have discussed or we have linked Ind AS 38, we have linked Ind AS 103, we have also linked Ind AS 12, that is deferred taxes. We have linked Ind AS 27, that is standalone financial statements. There are various linkages to this standard. I hope it is clear to you all. In case of any queries, we'll discuss the queries right now. And you can post on to your queries. So we'll discuss one by one each and every. I hope every concept is clear. In case any of the queries you have not raised right now, you can email it to me also. I've already given my email IDs. I'll give it to you again. So my email ID is I've noted it in the Excel sheet mentioned to you over here. So this is my email ID and this is my mobile number. So you can either WhatsApp me the queries or email me the queries. Email is better because you can reply to it immediately. So you can note down on from the screen my email ID and the mobile number. If you have not posted these queries, then we can discuss these queries later on also. Let's cover whatever are the queries raised. And thereafter, just for a quick feedback, I will share with you certain Google Forms based on which you can give me feedback that what should be covered additionally or whatever other feedback based on various concepts. So this I will raise either today or tomorrow, and accordingly I will give that Google form to each one of you. We have also created WhatsApp groups. I request all of you, we have created WhatsApp groups for each and every day. So whoever participants are participating on that particular day, we have raised a WhatsApp group. So people raise queries on that WhatsApp groups. We solve queries on that group. We give the PPTs on that group. So the participants are requested to join that WhatsApp group also. The link might have already been shared. So we'll discuss the queries one by one. Just a moment. In CFS of accounts, if we have 60% in a subsidiary and subsidiary is having losses, what is the treatment for losses in case of CFS and for non-controlling interest? Good question. In Ind AS, you allocate the share of losses to the non-controlling interest even if there are losses to the company. And even if the balance of non-controlling interest is resulting into a negative balance. So the losses of the subsidiary company are allocated to the non-controlling interest even if the balance is resulting into a negative balance. This is answer to your question, Deepak Lohia. Then secondly, one more linking concept is under Ind AS, you club NCI as a part of your equity. So your non-controlling interest is disclosed under the equity component. And whoever were there on day one, we have discussed statement of changes in equity. So even in this statement of changes in equity, non-controlling interest will form a part. So you have to show a reconciliation between this non-controlling interest. That is, you have to show opening balance of non-controlling interest, gains and losses allocated to the NCI, any changes in NCI, and then the closing balance. This you have to give for the current year and the comparative year. Second question is, can you Excel sheet okay will share up? In spite of holding more than 20% in an entity, the shareholder does not have representation in board, do not take part in decision making or exercise any sort of control, how will investment be shown in financial statement? Now please understand, if I'm having a shares more than 20%, okay, but there is no shareholding agreement which is restricting my rights given in my shares, in that cases, it is your subsidiary, it is your associate, in spite of the fact that you are not taking part in any of the board meetings. Why it is such that you are given a right, you are exercising or not exercising the right, that's a different case. But since you have the right in that cases, your right is not restricted by any other agreement, still it is your associate company because you have the right. It is getting exercised or not, that's a different question. In consolidation, if holding company has pledged significant amount of shares of subsidiary and in case where it is probable that bank would sell such cases, since holding company is not financially healthy, would it affect my consolidation? Unless such sale of shares happen, until and unless there will be no impact on consolidation. Second is under Ind AS 115, if my business is of NBFC and during the period I incurred marketing cost, including salary of my marketing team, normally all loans financed, I need to capitalize them. No. There is no capitalization required in the to the tenure of the loan. This is not the case. So Gokul, Mr. Gokul, this is the answer to your question. There is no capitalization of this cost required into your loan amounts. Then where to recognize revenue under CIF terms. Now, terms of the contracts, this is purely clear. This was same under the Indian GAAP also. If there are CIF terms of contract, you will recognize the revenue only when the goods reach the customer's location. Until and unless you won't recognize the revenue in such cases. When the revenue is recognized for builder and developer, it's possible for project completion contract. This is a classic case wherever you have sale of flats. Now it depends upon the terms of the contract, but in majority of the cases when revenue recognition was applied on the first time in India, wherever there is sale of retail flats, in such cases the revenue recognition model had come down from over the period of time to at point in time. Now each and every builder who is having sale of flats, now you see DLF company, they are recognizing revenue at point in time for their sale of flats. Why is it so? Because none of the three conditions of the over period of time of revenue are getting satisfied in such cases. Because for the third condition also to be satisfied, if the contract is cancelled in between, you should be reimbursed with cost plus margin, which doesn't happen. And in many cases, you don't have a customer itself until the project is entirely completed. So in many cases, for the builders who are selling the retail flats, the revenue recognition has changed from over the period of time to at point on time. This is a very big change and it has impacted to the companies in a very bigger manner. Again, one more thing, previously under Indian GAAP, you had a specific guidance note for revenue recognition for such construction companies. But under Ind AS, you don't have a separate guidance note, and Ind AS 115 itself is applicable to such kind of companies. Then, next question we'll discuss. The value bifurcation as per 115 and also the timing of recognition may not match with the GST law of the valuation or time of supply or the definition. Yeah, it is true. GST law is separate and your financials are separate. So you have to apply GST concepts for the GST purposes, and then in your GST audit report, you will give a reconciliation between the revenue what is appearing in your P&L and what revenue you have shown for the financial purpose. That is very true. Consideration payable, I discussed it later on. I hope I've addressed every query. If there is a past trend of bad dates and cash discounts, how will this impact revenue from operations? Cash discounts will be netted off against revenue from operations, whereas bad dates won't be netted off against revenue from operations, because bad dates is not a variable consideration. It will be debited to your P&L account itself and it will be debited to the other expenses component. And again, one more thing, you have to apply Ind AS 109 to compute the bad dates. It is called as expected credit loss model under Ind AS. So if you're there yesterday, you would understand what is expected credit loss. If you're not there yesterday, then you have to refer the concept under Ind AS 109. So over here, another question is Ind AS 10115. Do you mean 100% of variable consideration will be netted off against revenue? Yeah, 100% of your variable consideration will be netted off against revenue. So in this new standard, you just compare the annual reports. There are various companies whose top line has reduced due to this concept of netting it off against the revenue from operations. And the last question is early completion bonus. Early completion bonus, it does not hamper the prudence concept because the standard itself says that based on a past trend, you are estimating the early completion bonus. So prudence concept does not impact over here because you're using the past trend to establish how much bonus you're going to receive. So this is all about, we have discussed the queries also, and it was very good session with you all. The queries were also very intelligent queries. And please, why we are discussing this Ind AS is, it will be very helpful for you all to discuss all these concepts. So even if you are not getting an implementation assignment, you might get certain review assignments. So you might have various friends who are having Ind AS companies and they are not knowing Ind AS. Even today in Pune, there are so many people who are not well versed of Ind AS. So in that cases, if you're getting a good handholding over Ind AS, you can review the financial statements of the company. So out of 100 CS, if there are 5 CS who are aware about Ind AS, at least you can review the work of what these 100 CS are certifying. Because period on period, many companies are coming into the Ind AS regime. So in my past experience of 4 years, Today I have such a huge experience that even by looking into the financial statements of the company, I can identify what are the errors and in what form they have not complied with the Ind AS and what they should have done. So these financial statements are published in ROC, are published in annual reports. There are some listed companies. Many companies can point out the errors what you are making in such Ind AS financial statements because many errors are very evitable errors. So when you're certifying or when you're auditing a Ind AS financial statements, it is very important that you know such concepts. And we have seen big listed companies who make such mistakes in their financial statements, and these mistakes are very evident from the financial statements that they have not applied this Ind AS concept. That is why I'm trying to cover at least the major concepts which are applicable to the company. So after attending this session of 5 to 6 days, I would be at least happy if you can apply these common concepts in your Ind AS financial statements, or at least you know these differences. Once you know these differences, what I would like you to do is take up a particular annual report under Indian GAAP. You yourself list down the differences, what are there as compared to the Indian GAAP, and then refer to its Ind AS annual report and just compare whether you are able to identify all the differences between the Indian GAAP and the Ind AS. So if you can do this exercise at least for 2 to 3 annual reports, it would be very happy for me also that you were able to identify the differences between the Indian GAAP and Ind AS, and you knew what had to be done for these kind of adjustments. And even in that cases, if you have any queries, you can at any time come back to me. I have already given you my email IDs and my mobile numbers. So it was good session with you all, and over to you, Virag. Virag, if you are there, then we have completed with the session, and you can join up. So based on my past 4 days, I'm receiving very good queries on my email ID also. I'm trying to reply each and every query on the same day itself, but still whoever not have got replies for these queries, I'll reply it by today or tomorrow. But good and intelligent queries I'm receiving. So I'm happy that you're attending the lecture in a very attentive manner. Only if you attend the lectures, you get such intelligent queries. It's very good.
Yes, we also received good response, good feedback, and also many are suggesting more session. So that's why we are arranging tomorrow also, and more feedback. We will coordinate with the Shweta and we will finalize things. Thank you so much, guys. Please join us for our other session starting from tomorrow also. Many also tomorrow's timing for Ind AS is 4 p.m. Kindly note that tomorrow there is not 5 p.m. 4 p.m. and kindly note the number and also join our WhatsApp group. Hope all are on WhatsApp group. We have sent the link on email. Please check that.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
So
Thank you, Viraj.
thank you so much. Yes. We are ending the webinar now. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you so much, guys.